Thank you guys for joining us for the Youth Field Day this year. My name is Kai Sales. I am Dr. Brent Seller's master's student in the Weed Science Lab, and I'm also the Ag and Natural Resources Extension Agent in Citrus County. But today we're going to be talking about some cool stuff. But before we get started, I wanted to ask everyone here, can you give me a good definition of what is a weed? A weed here says it's an unwanted plant. But the weed is considered any kind of plant that causes injury to human activity or injury to livestock and interferes with that human activity. So say you have a pasture that you're growing forage for your animals and you have plants that are affecting that production. They're unwanted plants. That is considered a weed. Now, second question here is, why are weeds so successful? Why are they hard to control? And then we have to touch on some important points about the weed biology. So the first point that I wanted to point out here is seed dormancy. Comparing weeds and crop seeds or forage seeds, our crop and forage seeds were selected to hit the ground and sprout and germinate. We're not expecting them to be in the ground more than 14 days. Comparing that to the weed seeds have this seed dormancy. They can go into the ground and stay dormant, stay sleeping in the ground for 15, 20, even 50 years. So that makes them very hard to control, because you might have a couple weeds one season and next season you'll have more weeds. They're always coming back because these seeds are just waiting for that right moment to pop up and germinate. They're waiting for the right moisture in the soil, the right amount of light coming out. If they have a hard seed coat, they're waiting for the rain to drag them along so they can scratch that seed coat and pop up and germinate. So that's what we talk about when we talk about seed dormancy. Those are some important points. The second point that I want to talk about why weeds are so difficult to control is that they have a rapid growth rate. They compete for resources. So they are gonna sprout, they're gonna really grow fast, and they're gonna compete for light. And by competing with light, they're covering, when we talk about broadleafs, they're covering the forages or the crops, preventing from that light from hitting that, crop or forage so that it can grow. They're competing for light, they're competing for moisture in the soil. We have weeds that have what we call tap roots, which are deep roots that can hit that moisture on lower levels in the soil. And they also compete for nutrients. So they're very aggressive when we think about weeds in a pasture or in a crop setting. Another thing that makes them very hard to control is that they produce a lot of seed. And I wanted to pinpoint one of the plants here. This is called a pigweed, spiny pigweed, and you can really identify it by looking at the reddish on the stems, and then you can also look at these tiny little spikes that are very prickly here. So this plant will sprout or germinate, and it will grow up and produce seed heads. These seed heads of one plant can produce up to 230,000 seeds. That is a lot of seeds. So think about one plant produces 230,000. How about 10, 15, 20 plants? That is a lot of seeds that are going into your soil. And the issue there is that you don't really know if it's gonna be germinating the next day or the next week or even in a couple years because of that seed dormancy. But this is a really good example of how aggressive weeds are in producing seeds. Now, when we talk about controlling weeds, we have to take a integrated management approach. And that is using the 5 methods we have here for weed management. So we have preventative, which is our first method, and that is what we're going to be talking here today in weed identification, where if you spot a different plant that is coming in your pasture and you look at it and you see, okay, I don't want that plant in my pasture. So you're preventing that plant from becoming a problem by IDing it and controlling it the right way. Then we have cultural, which is just by giving the right nutrition and the right management for your forage or for your crop, so that it is that first barrier against those seeds that will be germinating from the weeds. So that cultural management, just proper management, proper nutritional management, will give that energy, for the plant to survive and to compete against the weeds. Then we have mechanical. Mechanical is basically by mowing those weeds specifically before they set seed, because that you're cutting their next generation of weeds that will germinate. So mowing those weeds before they set seed, or even grazing. Animals can be used as a grazing as a mechanical method of control. Like goats are great weed eaters. They eat every kind of plant, and weeds are one of their favorite dishes. So goat is a great mechanical way. And our cows, they also eat plants that normally are young. So there might be a young weed that's coming up. They will be able to eat that. And that's considered our mechanical way of weed management. Then when we talk of biological, biological is a great topic. But the issue with biological is that it's very weed specific. So we might have one beetle that eats tropical soda apple. The issue there is that we're gonna be able to control tropical soda apple, but if we have 5, 10 different species of weeds out there, we're gonna have a larger problem if we're just relying on biological. Now, the last one and the most used one and cost effective is the chemical. Chemical control, you have to be very careful with what you're doing, because you have to read the label of the products and the right amount that you have to put out for the certain weeds. If you're putting too much chemical out, first you're increasing your cost because you're gonna really kill that plant, but you're gonna affect the environment as well and increase your cost. And secondly, if you're putting less below the amount required to control that plant, you're not gonna have effective weed control, and you're gonna have to waste time to go back out there and spray that plant again. So you're increasing your costs because you're spraying 2 times, and you are wasting your time because you're gonna have to go out and spray again. So the best approach for this is using each method as in conjunction. So you're using a little bit of cultural with proper nutrition, using mechanical with mowing, and you're using chemical as a way of controlling some other weeds. So using these in conjunction, it's a more sustainable way and more environmental friendly way of weed management. But today we're talking about preventative, and specifically in preventative weed identification. So in weed identification, there are some points that I want to brush upon to talk when you're looking at the field and you find a different plant. What are some characteristics that you should look on that plant to really be able to identify it? So the first one is the leaves. So we have, first thing that you can look at when you're talking about, when you're looking out in the field, is seeing if that plant is a grass-like plant or if it's a broadleaf plant. And that is really easy to spot on when you're looking out in the field. Then when we look more to the leaves, we have what we call narrow leaves that are the grass-like, that are very narrow. And then we have what we call broad leaves. So the broad leaves are those wide leaves. They're very good for covering that sunlight that comes in and affects any foliage that's growing down here. The next thing that we have to look is at our leaf margins. Some plants have margins that are smooth, so you don't see any jagged edges or dentures throughout the leaf margins. And other plants have those that I just mentioned, those jagged edges, those teeth around the plant, teeth around the leaf, and even what we call lobed leaves is that these larger indentations throughout the plant. So those are some important characteristics when you look at leaves. Another thing that I really wanted to point out is the veins in the leaves. So when you look at a leaf, especially with broadleafs, you might see a webbed vein. You see how all those veins spread out throughout the leaf. Now when you look more into a grass style, normally they're gonna have parallel veins that go along that midrib and go along the margins of the leaf. So those are some important characteristics when you're looking at leaves. The second point when identifying weeds are the stems. Now stems are really important because they can change throughout time. So we have stems that are herbaceous, which are the soft, fleshy stems that you can bend, break, and they're very pliable. And we have also what we call woody stems. Now some plants, they start off as a herbaceous stem, and then they grow and mature and become a woody stem. So it's kind of hard to identify those 2 points, and you have to pay attention to the maturity of the plant. But normally when you're looking at stems, you have to see if the stem has any kind of hairs on the stem, or for the case of our pigweed here, we have a lot of spines on it, and these are methods of protection from the weed. You know, these are to protect from grazing of animals, from livestock. It's a way of preventing them from really eating through this plant and be able to set those seeds down. So we look at herbaceous stems, we look at woody stems, but we also have vining stems. And those are plants that grow on vines. And here's an example of an air potato. You can see how it vines through anything that it can latch on. It will vine up, and it has what we call tendrils. It's the same thing that we see on muscadine grapes or grapes themselves. They have those little tendrils that it's kind of a little twirl of the stem that latches onto anything and grows up into the heights to get that higher sunlight impact there. Now, the last thing that I would like to point out in our presentation here is the flowers. Weed flowers are beautiful. There are several different types of colors, arrangements, but it's really important to look if we have more of a clustered arrangement, which is a lot of tiny flowers in a little cluster, and then we have more of a tubed arrangement where you can really see that tube of the flower, and more of a petal arrangement, like a star petaled, 5 petals there. So the arrangement of the flowers, the color of the flowers are some that really can help identify the weeds. Now, another thing is to point out is when you find weeds that already have their flowers up, that is, you're already a little too late to control them, because this is the last stages of reproduction. So they're gonna put their flowers up, set their fruit, their seed, and they're already gonna let that seed on for the next generation of plants. So it's really easy to identify, but you're already a little too late, and you're gonna have to come in with a couple other control measures to hit that, to control that weed. But what the activity that I have for you guys today, I have several different potted plants out in the field, and I have ID'd them with tags that are different weeds that we find in our pastures and in our crops. And I have different cards for you guys to go out there and hunt these weeds. What I want you guys to do is to match the weed with the picture that we have here, write down their name that is on the tags, and with what we learned here of characteristics in leaves, stems, and flowers, write down some kind of description that you think fits for this plant. If it's gonna be a spiny stem, or if it's gonna be a fuzzy leaf, write those characteristics down to really narrow down your technique, your technique of weed identification. So this is really, it's gonna be an awesome activity. I'll let you guys go out in the field, look at the plants, see what you find of different, what is the characteristics that pop out, and write those descriptions down. And then we'll come back here and we'll finish off our activity for today. All right, I hope you guys had fun hunting some weeds. So let's go over a couple of the weeds out there today. So the first one we have here in the right corner is blackberry, very characteristic from those thorns you guys saw on the stem, and it has those jagged edges on its leaves. The second one we found out there is sickle pod. You can really see that teardrop leaf on it, a very upright growth compared to creeping indigo that we also have out there. If you look at the pot of creeping indigo, you can see that the plant is looking to go down to the ground. The name itself says it's creeping. Sickle pod has similar leaves, but it's more of an upright growth. Now here we have white headbroom, characteristic because it has the whorled leaves around the stem, and then it has a white button flower that the stem grows from that flower and produces another flower on top. So it's very, very cool weed to look at. The next one on the list here is common purslane. You can really see those red stems on it, and it's a succulent plant. Very, very fleshy on that. Then on the corner here we have bracken fern, poisonous plant to livestock. At least most of these plants are poisonous to livestock, but this is a very highly poisonous one to livestock. It looks like a fern, very similar to a fern right there. Then on the bottom corner here we have Caesar weed, and this is a great example of a broadleaf, and also you can see that Caesar weed has some indentations, which are those leaves that we call lobed leaves. So next on here we have the arrowleaf sida, and an awesome way to look at this one, if you look at the leaf that you guys looked at, you can see it really looks like an arrowhead. So that is very characteristic for this plant. And then finally, we have dog fennel. Dog fennel is the #1 weed in Florida pastures, and it is very problematic. The example we have here of dog fennel is a young dog fennel, but the older it gets, you can see those really woody stems that really show a great example of this weed. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed today's Youth Field Day activity with the weed hunt. Please look through your booklets. There are several resources, great resources to help you on your next weed identifications. The first resource that I really like to go to is the Range Cattle Resource and Education Center website. They have a weed identification tool with pictures of the main pasture weeds and the names of those weeds. So it's a great resource to have on weed identification. The next resource is also from the University of Florida, which has videos that go more in detail of characteristics of each of those weeds. It has more on the ornamental side, but it also touches on the pasture side. And finally, there's an awesome resource also from the University of Florida, which is you can identify your weed based off the color of the flower. So it will ask what type of color is the weed, and then we'll break down into other characteristics of what you see on that weed. So it's a really cool tool to play around and help you identify in your next weed adventures. So I hope you had a great day and enjoy the rest of the Youth Field Day.